I'm Dr. Amita Paliwal. I specialize in medieval Indian history. I'm assistant professor in Jesus and Mary College of University of Delhi, India. I'll be talking today about the rise of Islam and its spread in the world, specifically in Asia, in India. So by the early 7th century in West Asia, there existed a combination of cultured, settled world and a world on its frontiers, which was in closer contact to its northern neighbors and opening itself up to their cultures. The power of the Byzantine, defeated by the Ottomans in 1453, and the Sassanid Empire, lost it to the Arabs in 651, was somewhat on a decline, while the settled tribal communities in Arabian Peninsula were consolidating their position, and some of them on the borderlands were actively participating in the politics of Syria and Iraq. Soon, a new political order was created in which the ruling group was formed not only by the people of the earlier empires, but by the Arabs from Western Arabia, particularly Hejaz. The new political order identified itself with the revelation given by God to Muhammad in the form of Quran. Abul Qasim Muhammad bin Abdullah was born in Mecca in 570 CE. He belonged to the Hashim clan of the tribe of Quraysh. Quraysh had well established themselves in the field of trade and commerce and were counted among the wealthiest merchants of Arabia, though the clan of Muhammad was not the most prominent one within it. Due to their role in trade, they emerged as the single most powerful tribe of the peninsula. In fact, trade was not the only source from where their prominence sprang. The control of the sanctuary Kaaba, where the images of local gods were kept, and which was central to the religious orientation of the people of the region, by the Quraysh, enhanced the prestige of the tribe. Now, they had fostered the pilgrimages and accompanying fairs, made it certain seasons to Mecca itself and to a neutral spot not very far away, that is Arafat, as well as other markets held in the region. Muhammad had grown up as an orphan under the care of his uncle Abu Talib. He had shown his competence as a trader in the service of a well-to-do widow, Khadija, whom he married later. In his 30s, Muhammad seems to have become engrossed with the questions of how to live a serious life of truth and purity. He meditated intensely during periods of retirement in a cave on Mount Hira outside the town. He did not disassociate himself from the rites and customs of the Quraysh, which indeed continued to be dear to him, but he sought something more which they lacked. Around the age of 40, during one of his retirements in Mount Hira, he heard a voice and saw a vision, which summoned him to offer worship to the God who had created the world, one God of the monotheist. Encouraged by his wife Khadija, he accepted the summons as coming from God himself. Thereupon, he received further messages which he interpreted as divine revelations, and the prayer recitation of which formed a major element of the new cult. The messages collectively were called the Quran. For a time, only his wife and a few close friends shared the cult with him, but after some years, the messages demanded that he summons his fellow Quraysh to the worship of God, warning them of impending calamities if they refused. From a private monotheist, he was to become a prophet to his people. As support for Muhammad grew, his relations with the leading families of the Quraysh became worse. They did not accept his claim to be the messenger of God and was considered as someone who attacked their way of life. The situation of Muhammad became dodgy when Khadija and Abu Talib died in the same year. As the teachings developed, more opposition from the followers of accepted beliefs became clearer. Muhammad realized that for the safety of his men, to overcome the resistance of Quraysh and to increase the number of his adherents, some political base was necessary. Finally, His position became so difficult that in 622 CEE, he left Mecca for an oasis settlement 200 miles to the north, Yathrib, later known as Medina. Now, this movement to Medina in 622 CE is known as the Hijrah, and that's where the Islamic calendar began, the date from which the Muslim era began. Medina was an agricultural oasis. Like Mecca, it was non-inhabited by a single tribe, but unlike Mecca, it was definitely marked by the bitter feuds between the leading tribal groups, the Aus and the Khazraj, which threatened at times the existence of Medina. Also, like Mecca, Medina was undergoing social changes, which was undermining Bedouin form of kingship. Agriculture, rather than the pastoral needs, governed its economy, and its social life was increasingly governed by spatial proximity rather than kinship ties. He had been welcomed by the inhabitants of Medina, who accepted him as the arbitrator of their disputes. In a society with no common law or government, a man with a religious vision and who was just politically tactful was often selected by the feuding clans as the arbitrator. The early biographers have preserved the text of agreement signed between the adherents of Muhammad on one hand and the two main tribes, Aus and Khazraj, together with some Jewish groups on the other. From Medina, Muhammad began to consolidate his power and soon entered in an armed struggle with the Quraysh. The community came to believe that it was necessary to participate in the wars to fight for what was right. First, Muhajirun, the exiled Meccans, raided Meccan caravans for booty. The raids soon turned into battles, and by 624, at the Battle of Badr, Muhammad defeated a large Meccan force and won tremendous prestige everywhere in Arabia. It was taken as divine favor, which led to the defection of some of the Bedouin tribe who had the responsibility to protect the Meccans' caravan lines. In the following years, Meccans took the initiative and attacked Muhammad and Medina first in the Battle of Uhud, 625, and then in the Battle of Khandaq, which was in 627. Though the first one was a defeat for Muhammad, but both the battles proved profitable for him. He faced the worst attacks of Mecca. However, each time the circumstances helped him to consolidate his position with the Jewish clans of Medina. Muhammad's aim was not to fight Mecca till death, but to convert a people to Islam. Therefore, he eased after the Battle of Khandaq. In 628 CE, Muhammad, along with his followers, made a pilgrimage to Kaaba. According to Era Lapidus, he did this to show that Islam was an Arabian religion and would preserve the pilgrimage rites in which Mecca had a great stake. The idea that Abraham was the founder of high monotheistic faith and the sanctuary at Mecca already existed. Now he was seen neither a Jew nor a Christian, but a common ancestor of both, and as ancestor of Muslims too. There was also a change in Muhammad's relation with Quraysh and Mecca. Muhammad concluded a truce at Al-Hudaybiyah as he marched for pilgrimage, in which the Meccans agreed to admit the Muslims for the pilgrimage, and Muhammad dropped his demand that he be regarded as the prophet of God. Moreover, he agreed to an unequal arrangement. According to this treaty, children who left Mecca to become Muslims would have to be returned if they did not have parental consent, while Muslim apostates would not to be returned. Though this was an unequal alliance, Muhammad made tremendous gain from it. Muhammad was a power to contend with, and that Mecca had given up her efforts to defeat him. Muhammad's adherents in Mecca continued to swell. In 630 CE, the leaders of the city of Mecca surrendered it to Muhammad, who occupied it without resistance. He gave amnesty to everyone and announced that principles of new order that every claim of the privilege of blood or property is abolished by him except the custody of shrine Kaaba and the watering of the pilgrims. In the year 632, Muhammad died. Now, there are two basic theories regarding the rise of Islam. First is the Meccan trade theory or the commercial wealth theory, and second is the nativist theory. The Meccan trade theory was propounded by Montgomery Watt. He saw the emergence of new religion as a result of deeper socio-economic changes and tried to look at why did it gain such wide acceptance among Arab tribes within a short span of time. Montgomery Watt, who has written many books on Muhammad and his life, like Muhammad at Mecca and Muhammad at Medina, examines the nature of society on the eve of the emergence of Islam. He sees the rise of Islam as a response to the transformation which was taking shape due to the trade and adoption of sedentary lifestyle by some tribes in the region. Mecca was the juncture of two major trade routes. One went north and south through the mountainous Hijaz from the Yemen and Indian Ocean lands to Syria and Mediterranean lands, and the other, less important, went east and west from Iraq, Iran, and Central Eurasia to Abyssinia and Eastern Africa. Meccan traders were involved in a long-distance trade. The Quraysh controlled the north-south trade route and enhanced their riches through his lucrative trade. It was at Mecca that the most striking changes occurred. The expansion of Meccan commerce eroded traditional ties and introduced tensions in the society. The wealth from trade or earnings from pilgrims brought into Mecca did not benefit everyone uniformly. The rise of Mecca as hub of expanding international trade network caused a number of problems: greater social stratification, greater social inequalities, and greater dependence of poor classes on wealthier ones. Now, this led to conflicts at various levels. The relatively simple tribal organization of Quraysh had no mechanism to cope with his new situation. Moreover, there were tribes which were taking up agriculture on a limited scale and other coming within the orbit of settled societies on the peripheries of Arabia. Muhammad's call for unity was an answer to this new emerging social differentiation, and Islam provided these tribes with a scheme for social formation. Now, in this scenario, Muhammad emerged and his proclaimed message was intended to dissolve the tribal units altogether and led to the formation of a single community. Since the movement declared equality of all men before God, communities facing social inequalities now acquired or were expected to acquire much greater social economic equality. The movement emphasized on social justice and rejection of all forms of hierarchical class differentiation in the Arab society. The emergence of Prophet and the success of his teachings are interpreted in terms of solutions he provided to the contemporary social problems. Similar opinion has also been put forward by other historians like Rodinson in his work Muhammad and Marshall Hodgson in Venture of Islam, and M.A. Shaban in Islamic History, a New Interpretation, AD 600 to 750. The next is the nativist theory. The hypothesis of Watt that the Quraysh transition to a mercantile economy undermined the traditional order of Mecca generated social and moral malice to which Muhammad's teaching was the answer, was challenged by Patricia Crone. She asserted that the Mecca traded in humble products rather than in luxury goods, while Watt argued that Mecca was the transit point on the long-distance trade between India, Africa, and Mediterranean. Patricia Crone, on the basis of Kester in 1986, asserted that trade was of a humble kind. The international trade of Makkans rested largely on articles such as leather and clothing. She questioned, could they have founded commercial empire of international dimensions on the basis of leather goods and clothing? Looking at the articles of trade, she concluded that trade in spices was very little and there existed almost no exchange trade in gold and silver. Other items like resin, wine, slaves, and other things were sold exclusively within Arabia. It was leather which was traded on a large scale, and clothing, animals, and miscellaneous food stuff, though less attested, probably had a large circulation. She proposed three negative points. First, it was not a transit trade. Makkan were considered as middlemen in a long distance trading network. They used to collect native and foreign goods from South Arabia and Ethiopia and transported them to Syria and Iraq. But according to Crone, goods they sold in the north were of North Arabian origin and not of Indian and South Asian origin. Perfumes were purchased from South Arabia for resale in the north and in Hijaz, not for sale in Byzantine or in Persian Empire. Moreover, any Meccan goods, be it perfume or other items, were destined for redistribution within these regions. They were markets for Hijazi leatherware and clothing, Yemeni perfumes in the cities of southern Syria, Hira, but not to Antioch, Constantinople, or Ctesiphon. Second, it was not a trade of a kind that attacked the attention of Greek and the Fertile Crescent. There is a mention of political importance of Arabia, but Quraysh and their trading centers were not at all mentioned in Greek, Latin, Syrian, Aramaic, and Coptic, or in any other literature composed outside Arabia. Third, it was not a trade that presupposed control of any trade route in Arabia. Patricia opines that the silence of sources explained the nature of trade itself, and that it should have attracted the attention outside Arabia had it been on a large scale. Quraysh were traders, and therefore their commercial activities were of the kind conducted in this region since time immemorial. Control over trade routes, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Ethiopia, is therefore meaningless, and sources do not assert that Meccans were in control of any trade routes or dominated the export trade of any particular locality, let alone monopolize the trade of Arabia at large. Clearly, it was a local trade. For Patricia Crone, Meccans traded in humble goods than in luxury items. She further points out that such a brief period of commercial wealth was not likely to upset Meccan society to a radical change. It took more than a century of commercial success to undermine the tribal order of population that had been neither uprooted nor forced to adopt a different organization in connection with its economic activities. Now, viewed as pagan enemies of Islam, the Meccans were accused of neglect of kingship ties and other protective relationships, as well as having a tendency for the strong to eat the weak. However, looking at the sources, it seems that Meccans preferred their traditional way of life to Islam. It is for this that they have been penalized in sources. One should not forget that the message was accepted in Medina. They accepted monotheism. The Meccans had to be conquered before they were to be converted. It seems that the problems of which the Meccan had solution must have been the problems shared by the people of Medina. Patricia, after making these points, posed another question, that why a social reform in Mecca would explode across the entire peninsula. Clearly, one must concentrate on issues which were common to Arabia and not just Mecca. Islam originated in tribal setup. Their gods were ultimate source of natural phenomena, rain, fertility, diseases, etc., that were of great importance to human life but beyond their control. They were worshipped for practical importance and the services they could render in controlling these phenomena. but they neither required nor received emotional commitment, love, and loyalty from their devotee. A god was no more than a powerful being, and the point of serving him was that he could expected to respond by using his power in favor of the servants or devotees. The practice, like the great annual pilgrimage, were apparently not conducted in the name of any one single deity. Pre-Islamic Arabia had less developed mythology, economy, rituals. Religious life was reduced to periodic visits to holy places. They were not involved in complex questions about nature and meaning of life. Was death the end? The concept of religion as the ultimate truth concerning nature and meaning of life was absent. So conversion was not due to any spiritual crisis, religious decadence, or decline of pagan beliefs. What the mass conversion shows is that the Prophet Muhammad offered them a program, a strategy, a roadmap of Arab state formation and conquest. It is believed that the turning point of Prophet Muhammad's career came when he began to attack the ancestral god of Quraysh. He attacked the very foundation of his tribe. It was not monotheism which posed a threat to pagan sanctuary or Meccan trade. The Meccans were not willing to tolerate an attack on their ancestors, but Muhammad had a vision for alternate community. In denouncing his ancestors, he demonstrated that his God was incompatible with tribal divisions as they existed. He showed that his God was both a single and an ancestral deity. Allah was the one and only God of Abraham, the ancestor of Arabs. Since around ancestral deities, groups formed, therefore it was around Allah and Allah alone that the Arabs should be regrouped. All ancestral deities that sanction current divisions being false. It is indeed fascinating that Muhammad and his successors were able to bring the unification in effect in a region which had never been politically united. The society of Medina was divided by feuds. It was not difficult to explain why they would be willing to experiment with the Prophet Muhammad's political program. But why did Arabs in Muhammad's time find vision of state structures and unification so attractive? Crone argues that he preached state formation and conquest, and without conquest, unification of Arabia was not possible. It was a period when Persians and the Byzantines were encroaching upon Arabian Peninsula, and their presence was felt throughout the peninsula. Arabia had been subjected to foreign rule. In such a scenario, Islam originated as a nativist movement, and in other words, as a primitive reaction to alien domination. Nativist movements were primitive in the sense that those who engaged in them were people without any political organization. She sees early Islam as nativist movement born out of deep attachment to Arabian way of life in opposition to penetration of foreign influences. The foreign influences were identified by her as those values which were introduced by Byzantine and Persians' attempts to dominate it. But then Crone also agrees to the view that sedimentization was taking place in certain parts of Arabia, which necessitated the growth of state structure at the expense of tribal ties. Patricia believed monotheism was used by Muhammad to galvanize Arab reaction to the encroachments of late antiquities or superpowers, Byzantine and Sassanid Persia. However, conceptually, her idea of economic and military imperialism and Arab nationalism has inherent flaws. She weaved the plausible around the obscure. But why were the Arabs became so important at this time or juncture? Can a movement so successful be based only on conquest? Patricia also made arbitrary selection of sources to fit in her arguments. If Quraysh's system of agreements with tribes on commerce be rejected as fabrication, then it became more difficult to account for the ascendancy established by Quraysh and inherited by Muhammad. As Makkah lacked natural resources, foodstuffs such as grain and date had to be imported. To purchase it must have had some sources of income. Now, R.B. Sargent, reviewing her work, said that no doubt Quraysh commercial activity has been inflated by Western writers. Laymen and followers of his theory argue that the trade inherited by Meccans was of the scale described by Pliny and in Periplus, keeping in mind the trade pattern of the classical age. Now, W.A. Watt developed his theory out of it. Nonetheless, this does not negate the existence of Quraysh commerce. Crone has also questioned the argument that the Quraysh made regular journeys to points in northern Yemen and traded even in commodities. She argues that a commodity which was so plentiful in Syria and Byzantium, why would these countries be interested in importing it from elsewhere? Crone has emphasized that we need to look into other factors, also like demand for foreign rarities, fluctuation of prices, or scarcities arising from political actions. She also does not believe that such accidents or actions as piracy affected trading to any significant extent. Instead, weather conditions and many such other factors did play equally important role. However, it appears that Crone's whole treatment of the subject is strictly mechanical, not allowing scope for such eventualities. Interestingly, on the other hand, she talks about tribal sentiments and on the other hand, presence of a strong Arab consciousness. Both are contradictory. Though Patricia Crone's work has been criticized by many, Patricia's work of 1987 and also an earlier work of Michael Cook in 1977, with its provocative manner of presentation, ignited intense discussion among scholars about the origin of Islam. According to the revisionist theory, which is given by Fred Donner, which was in his lecture delivered at the University of Edinburgh, this was the study of Islam's origin, W. Montgomery Watts Publications, November 23, 2015, University of Edinburgh. Now, he made an extensive survey of the revisionist works being done on the subject of Islam's origin. The appearance of these first revisionist works completely revitalized the study of early Islam. He pointed out that another dimension was added in the 1970s, that is, the late antiquity studies. With Peter Brown's epoch-making book, The World of Late Antiquity in 1971, Brown's book included a final chapter on late antiquities as an appendix to the early Islamic theory, to the fall of Umayyads and the early Abbasids. Brown synthesized several fields of study that had hitherto been largely separate, and late Roman or the early Byzantine history, church history, and especially the history of the Eastern churches, the study of Sasanian history, and the study of early Islamic history. Brown conceived late antiquity extending from the 2nd to the 8th century CE in the Near East and Mediterranean, and portrayed this period as the one which was of the most dynamic cultural and social creativity rather than of the decline. Brown's integration of early Islamic history into the framework of late antiquity broadened the perspective of historians on early Islam. According to Donner, this is renewed interest in various forms of documentary evidence for this period. Studies of the coins and seals of the early Islamic and of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, and papyrology. The existence of papyri from the 7th century, written in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic, had long been known, but they had not, with few exceptions, much used by the historians. In 1980s, especially the first decade of 21st century, a number of scholars began working actively in Arabic papyrology. Even more striking were developments in the study of the archaeology of the early Islamic period. Now, until the 1960s, relatively little archaeological work had been undertaken that focused on the Islamic period in the Northeast. and much of what had been done was concerned principally with recovering works of Islamic art or the major architectural monuments. Now, beginning in the 1970s, however, there was an explosion of archaeological explorations conducted along border lines, often with an anthropological focus, especially in Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Turkey, with important work also undertaken in Iran, Egypt, Lebanon, and Yemen. Now, this work has helped in correcting serious misconceptions about the historical evolution of the Levant, particularly during the early Islamic period. For example, it had earlier been norm to assume that the rise of Islam coincided with the general collapse of prosperity. But the careful work of Donald Whitcomb, Alan Walmsley, and others have revealed that in many areas in Levant continued to flourish during the 7th and into the 8th centuries. The rise of Islam, rather than being seen as an episode of violent destruction and discontinuity, instead appears to be what Peter Pence called it, an invisible conquest, because at most sites in the Levant, the transition from the Byzantine to Islamic rule was so gradual as to be imperceptible, at least in terms of the archaeological evidence, in contrast to the image gained from literary sources, both Christian and Islamic. This burst of new works and the new evidence and novel interpretations of long known literary evidence resulted in the appearance of many new attempts to reconstruct what actually happened on the eve of origin of Islam. There was a wave of revisionist writings away from the traditional paradigm. These new writings proposed many new theories. Now, some of them claim that Islam was merely another form of Christianity, while a few often even question the presence of Prophet Muhammad. But all these are not backed by sources and the evidence and seen more mere speculations. We will not go into details because these are not supported by enough research.